Blacks could not leave their neighborhoods. Mexicans couldn't leave their neighborhoods. Arabs couldn't leave their neighborhoods. And if you did, woe be to you if you were caught in a white area where you shouldn't be. There are plenty of tales that can be recounted of men who were arrested, beaten to death, and had crack sprinkled over them to make it seem they died in a drug hit. There were men who lived in a neighborhood but didn't belong to a gang, who were beaten within an inch of their life and dropped within an enemy neighborhood in the hope that they would finish off that young man. This happened and still happens. And so this is what was going on during this time. Ronald Reagan came in for a second term in the year 1405. And the Abu Nidal group, which was a militant secular Palestinian group, were well documented in the news for their acts of terror. Now there's a typo here. The first recorded suicide bombing came from the Palestinian National Liberation Front, PNLF. That's from George Habash, Palestinian National Liberation Front. That was the first suicide bombing. I'd like to have you also add that it was founded by George Habash, who is an Orthodox Arab Christian. The first suicide bombing, the Palestinian National Liberation Front. George Habash is a Palestinian Orthodox Christian. That was the first suicide bombing recorded in the Muslim world. The woman that did so was called the Lady of Light. There was another bombing as well, later in Lebanon, in which the American soldier that survived it because he jumped out of the way in time, described, quote, "I will never forget the smile on that man's face when he came in the Toyota truck. I never saw a smile like that in my life," close quote. That was a survivor of a suicide bomb attack. So, Muslims came in late on the hijacking game. Hijacking game was started by a Palestinian National Liberation Front, which were Christians. The killings at the Olympics, Black September, were done by Christians. Muslims came late in the game for hijackings and suicide bombings. Our people do a lot of things, but this was a game that we came late in. And it was taught to us. Rock Hudson was the first recorded and self-admitted AIDS victim. Knowledge of AIDS was very restricted, and panic would often set in at schools across the U.S. regarding whether AIDS was airborne or could be transferred by touching. When the first AIDS reports came out, the hysteria that surrounded them, because people watched Rock Hudson shrink from this ongoing ladies' man into a sack of skeleton bones. And this man had been seen as this dashing ladies' man, and he comes out and says, not only am I homosexual, which broke many hearts, but I've also got AIDS, and it's killing me. And it began to eat away at his body and ravage what was left of his frame. It left nothing of him, a skeleton, as they describe him. People didn't know what to do regarding AIDS. People weren't sure whether was AIDS airborne? Was AIDS transferred by touching? So you had people that were hitting people with baseball bats if they touched them. You had parents pulling their children out of school because they said, we don't know whether maybe the children playing in the course of their play, maybe one of them has a cough and then he coughs on the other child and maybe he has AIDS. Children, if they got a cough or if they got chickenpox, immediately thought, because the rashes and sores are sort of similar to AIDS, children thought, I've got AIDS. 8-year-old children thought, I've got AIDS. I'm going to die. And it was an insane time. When Ryan White got AIDS, that shook everyone because he was just a child. Ryan White's got AIDS, that's it. World's finished. But up until this time, AIDS had been called, and I'm only using what was called at the time in the newspapers, it was called, quote, faggot cancer. Because the only people at the time that had it were homosexuals. Oh, it was the only people that had it. And it was being used at the time by some people to say, do you see? This is a punishment from your Lord to you for your wickedness. You are the highest risk sex group in the U.S. Stop this madness now. But it continued unabated. Out of all the groups that are studied by the United States government, women on women relationships, men on men relationships, heterosexual married and unmarried relationships, homosexual men on men and women on women have the highest rates of promiscuity. Their rates of promiscuity are sometimes classed as between 3 and 10 times more than heterosexual unmarried couples that are not in a committed relationship. But you see, we shouldn't be talking about that information because that's discrimination. Someone might get alienated. We don't want to talk about the highest risk group in the nation or in the world. Someone could get alienated. When you have an article in the newspaper in that same year of George Michael saying, quote, "My lover has no problem with me going out and saying, I'm going to get my backup at the club tonight, and he doesn't expect me until later that day," close quote. Someone can say this in a newspaper. But this is what was happening. So AIDS at that point was this unknown killer, but heterosexuals felt safe because they said, well, so far it seems to be just a gay killer. But people were concerned about contracting it. The Chernobyl disaster in India occurred in this same year of 1405 and maimed nearly 6,000 people at the same time as the Hanford nuclear disaster in the U.S. state of Washington. Now, they don't often mention this. They'll mention Chernobyl and the cleanup and how much that cost. They didn't clean up Hanford after the Hanford nuclear disaster in Washington state in the United States. They haven't even apologized to those people. Abu Nidal Group then hijacked Pan Am Flight 73 and took 358 people hostage. That was the first hijack in recorded history. The first hijacked plane to be brought down, in which the people were killed, was Sikh extremists in 1987, or just a year before this. You see, often we Muslims are given an enviable position of, you guys are hijacking this and hijacking that. Let's get some points straight. No one's saying hijacking's right. But the godfathers of hijacking are those who call themselves lovers of Christ and say that their Lord is Jesus, or that they love Guru Nanak Dev Ji. It is those people that are the godfathers of hijacking. The Muslims that do so are just as wrong. But let's put things in perspective. We did not found this way of doing things. It was already there. The United States Educational Industrial Complex, EIC, also known as the Department of Education, aggressively exports SAT exams, stating that students are at school to learn loyalty and not knowledge. Now think about this. Many people thought that SATs are from this country. Yeah, you got to sit your SATs. And if you look at the students, there's all this cramming and pushing and cramming and pushing. You've got to sit your SATs. You've got to sit your SATs. You've got to sit your SATs. And then they score on the SATs. You and I both know that these same students, on a practical level, can't properly read. They can't properly compute in math. But they sure score high on these SAT exams. That doesn't prove intelligence. I, with a group of 6 other kids, scored 100% on an SAT exam. I was 10. That didn't prove that I was smart. It just proved I knew to color in the little bubbles, to close my book when I was done, and to not talk because it's quiet hour. That doesn't prove intelligence. And most of the information in there is insulting to the average intelligence, because the way it is set up is to create a baseline intelligence across the SAT exams. And so you'll have schools that are, I remember there's a school in the United States, it's called, and I don't care about mentioning it, it's called Kent Ridge High School. It was thought to have, it's got the highest SAT scores in the nation. And 45% of its students are functionally illiterate. But their SAT scores are totally amazing. But the little suckers can't read. Can't read. The little beavers can't read. Lord help them, they can't read. Why? What's happened to them? Because of the fact that they know how to take exams, but they don't know how to learn. You had kids in the US taking their SAT scores, passing out, projectile vomiting. They weren't able to sleep at night because why? Their parents are saying, why can't you sleep? And they're saying, it's my exams tomorrow. Their parents are keeping the roof over their head and working every day, and they're snoring soundly, and their kids are only taking an exam and they can't sleep. They've got ulcers. Reports in the newspaper of hoary-headed kids where they've got gray hairs in their head. Why? Because of SATs. And so you have kids that are used to this exam-taking culture, but they never get tested in any other way. They only know how to take tests. And so you have a generation of kids that only know how to go to university. They can take exams and go to university and score on the university exam. Okay, now it's time to change the tire on your car. It's flat. Complete confusion. Now it's time to boil rice. You merely boil the water, put in the contents of the rice, stir it and wait for it to increase in size. Then take it off the stove and add your desired ingredients. They can't. We're going to teach you how to wash your clothes. You put in the clothes that are dirty, and in the small spot marked detergent, you put in the soap. You then depress the button that reads on. Please be sure to shut the door so as not to be soaked in water. Is it any wonder why they now have to start putting on shampoo bottles the directions, wet hair first? Look at this. Because it's an exam-taking culture. They're not taught to actually reflect and think. You got to take this exam. You can forget it all later, but you got to take this exam. I'll say this very quickly before I move on. So there was a young man who had graduated with all of these degrees and everything else. And he was writing these reports and writing these amazing essays, and people just thought he was one of the greatest writers in that time period. He's amazing, considered a genius in the state that he lived in. And I had the pleasure of meeting this individual. And I read one statement of his, and it didn't make sense to me. I said, could you explain this statement to me that you have written? To which his reply was, quote, half the time I don't even know what I mean myself when I write what I write. Close quote. This is that culture. This is that culture. People use this ephemeral language. Don't say such and such to so-and-so. This is, and they've got a polysyllabic word that describes what the thing is, and it never covers what they're meant to say. You've heard it. Words like gentrification. Racist. Racist. Right? Industrial reorganization. You're taking all the businesses out and starving the colored people. That's all it is. So-and-so suffers from post-traumatic stress syndrome. He's been in war and he cracked up. He's been in war and he cracked up. So-and-so has postpartum depression. They still haven't recovered from childbirth. But we have all of these flowery words to take away the punch in things. Okay, you're both going to play a football game, but we're not going to keep score because we're all winners. So people never get told when they're small that you have to work harder. You want to be a winner? You got to work hard. We lost today. Kids don't hear that.